Hi, Chris.
Hi, Neri. Great to be with you again. Thanks for giving me a second chance. Shall I go ahead?
Go ahead. The floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you again. It's great to be with you again today. The many documents we reviewed Monday establish the gold price suppression policy of Western governments, as well as its long duration. But even people unaware of those documents might easily come to suspect this policy on their own. Consider the telling action of the gold market itself. The gold price is often smashed out of the blue in the futures markets when there is no news relevant to gold particularly, or the currency markets generally. There are often waves of selling in gold futures by some entity that seems not to care about obtaining the best price for the metal it purports to be selling. An ordinary seller staggers his sales, selling a little at a time to avoid depressing the market price along the way. If you dump a lot of your asset on the market all at once, you crash the price. But careful profit maximizing selling of an asset is often not what happens with gold. Some entity frequently bombs the futures market, dumping huge amounts of futures contracts all at once, precisely to knock the price down. This is an entity that profits not from a rising price of gold, but from a falling price, and an entity that seems to have access to infinite money. Such attacks are almost certainly government interventions, likely conducted through the Bank for International Settlements and brokers representing government agencies. They knock the gold price down to keep government currencies and bonds up. There is also much counterintuitive action with the gold price. It often reacts the opposite of what you would expect. When there is some financial disaster or geopolitical crisis in the world, gold often falls instead of rises. This likely is also the result of government intervention. Consider the refusal of governments and central banks to explain. Can we go to slide 2, the slide of the US Federal Reserve building, if you've got the slides available today? Anyone who doubts Western gold price suppression policy can erase his doubt just by putting a question or two to Western governments and central banks, as Gada Long has done. Are central banks secretly involved in the gold market? Are they trading directly or through intermediaries like the BIS or investment banks? If so, what is the objective of this trading? Are they trying to manipulate currency values? Just what are they doing, for whom, and why? Why are central bank board of directors meetings and deliberations secret, if not to prevent the public and the markets from learning about secret interventions by government? Exactly what is government policy toward gold? Is there any policy, or is the government completely indifferent to the monetary metal? If you put such questions to a central bank and ever get any response, please let me know. If, as is more likely, you get no response or an evasive one, at least you'll have confirmed that a central bank doesn't want you to know what it's doing, doesn't want its own people to know what it's doing. Consider the failure of mainstream financial news organizations. While mainstream financial news organizations occasionally report about gold, their reporting is always superficial. If you follow that reporting for long, you will see that the first rule of mainstream financial journalism about gold is never put to a central bank a critical question about gold, or any question about gold for that matter. Indeed, for some time I have thought that the greatest power of Western central banking is not its power to create and deploy infinite money, but rather its ability to intimidate financial news organizations, or the innate cowardice of those organizations. For gold price suppression cannot work without deception, surreptitiousness, and misunderstanding. If mainstream financial news organizations ever exposed the scheme, investors would not participate in the markets that were being rigged, like the gold futures market. In that case, investors who wanted gold would purchase only real metal and remove it from the banking system. They would not purchase gold futures or gold supposedly held in trust for them by investment banks. Now, why are financial news organizations so negligent about gold? Partly it is because central banks and governments generally are newsmakers and can shut off the flow of news to any news organizations that offend them. And it is partly because the biggest advertisers for financial news organizations are the investment banks that themselves are agents of central banks in various markets, including the gold market. Any news organization that alienates the investment banks with critical reporting about market manipulation risks losing their advertising. Now, if we've got the slides, I can't tell here, but could we go to slide 3, the Wall Street Journal? Let me tell you about an exception that proves the rule here. In 2016, while I was attending a conference in Hong Kong, I got a telephone call from a reporter for the leading financial newspaper in the United States, the Wall Street Journal. She said she wanted to do a story about gold market manipulation. I was skeptical, having long been providing documents to her newspaper without result. But we talked at length on the phone, and I emailed her much of the documentation. For weeks and then months, I kept getting calls and emails from the Wall Street Journal reporter, so I kept sending her more material. I introduced her to 4 or 5 gold market experts associated with GATA. She interviewed them. Eventually, the reporter's inquiries seemed to be going nowhere, and I got tired of her. I told her that she was barking up the wrong tree, that she should stop bothering me, that I was merely an amateur observer of the official scene, and that she should try some ordinary journalism for a change. She should go to the source. That is, she should try putting questions not to me, but to the government institutions responsible for gold price suppression policy and the actions she claimed to be investigating. She should try questioning the US Federal Reserve and Treasury Department, not just GATA and the people associated with it. In August 2017, more than a year after the reporter's first call to me, and after GATA Chairman Bill Murphy had begun pushing her, her story was published on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The story quoted several of the experts to whom I had introduced her and reported the complaint that the Federal Reserve was secretly intervening in the gold market to suppress the gold price. But the story missed the crucial detail. That is, the story never put a question to the Fed itself. The story let GATA's experts accuse the Fed, but never asked the Fed to respond to the accusation. Of course, this violated the first rule of journalism, that if you report something unfavorable about someone or some institution, you must seek and report the institution's response. And if the institution will not respond, you must report that. That shows you how sensitive the gold issue really is. It is so sensitive that it caused the leading financial news organization in the United States to violate the first rule of journalism, to cheat its readers of the most basic information. I suspect that the Wall Street Journal may have sought comment from the Federal Reserve, and that the Fed said it didn't want to talk about the issue and didn't even want to be quoted as saying it didn't want to talk about it. Refusing to comment would look incriminating. So the newspaper obliged the central bank, as it almost certainly would not do for any other subject of a news story. The newspaper simply omitted the crucial detail. Now, how lovely and interesting it might be if West Africa's ambassadors in Britain and the United States called on the major financial news organizations in Britain and the United States to urge them to start reporting about gold price suppression by governments and central banks. GATA is full of specific questions journalists could put to governments and central banks if news organizations ever wanted to discover what really is going on in the gold market. Those questions are posted at GATA's internet site and will be linked in the internet posting of this presentation. If we have the slides, can we go to the mine pit slide on slide 4? Consider the failure of mining companies to act in the interests of their investors and the countries whose natural resources they exploit. GATA has been alerting gold mining companies to gold price suppression policy for 20 years now. GATA people have spoken at mining conferences in North America, Europe, Asia, and South Africa. A few mining companies, very, very few, have responded favorably, spoken publicly about the issue, and even supported GATA financially. But most mining companies have ignored the issue. It terrifies them. The gold mining industry has an international trade association, the World Gold Council, but the council actually represents very few mining companies, mainly the biggest ones, and has never addressed gold price suppression by governments and central banks. Indeed, the World Gold Council seems to exist mainly to ensure that there never is a World Gold Council, never any association to defend the gold mining industry and gold producing countries against hostile central banks. Thus, the World Gold Council forecloses the possibility that the gold mining industry might ever stand up for itself. It's not hard to understand the timidity of gold mining companies. First, mining is the industry most vulnerable to governments for mining permits, royalty requirements, enforcement of environmental regulations, and other regulations. Mining companies are properly scared of doing anything that might alienate their governments. Second, mining is the most capital-intensive business. Developing the typical mine requires hundreds of millions of US dollars and sometimes even billions of dollars. Such financing usually is available only from the biggest investment banks, banks that are formally agents of the major central banks. So gold mining companies fear that if they complain about the rigging of the gold market, their own banks will cut them off. But I would ask the miners what I would ask the gold producing countries. Do you want to risk dying on your feet or just die on your knees? If we've got slide 5, which is the Capitol building, consider the failure of the governments of gold producing countries. GATA has made many forays into South Africa and has had some contact with the country's central bank, but has gotten nowhere there. The gold mining industry in South Africa long has been steadily declining, and the South African government doesn't seem to mind, even as it cannot claim to be ignorant about Western gold price suppression policy. The South African government knows all about it. West Africa may have more of an excuse, since GATA has made no particular efforts here. But do your governments know all they should about the region's historic mineral resources and gold's past and potential role in the world financial system? Do they know that gold remains the secret knowledge of the world financial system, that it remains the measure of everything financial? I doubt it. For nearly every Western African country is a member of the International Monetary Fund, whose major objective is to demonetize gold, one of West Africa's primary exports. Over the years, the IMF has periodically sold gold in the name of raising money to help poor countries, but actually to knock the gold price down to protect the reserve currency status of the US dollar. Indeed, the IMF is based in Washington, and the United States holds controlling voting power in the IMF. The IMF's charter requires major decisions to be reached by 85% of the organization's voting allocations. The United States holds 16.5% of the voting allocations. So every IMF member country could vote to have the IMF do or not do something, and the vote would fail because it had only 83.5% of the voting allocations when 85% were needed. The IMF can't do anything unless the United States consents to it. That is, the IMF is an agency of US imperialism. Not coincidentally, the IMF also prohibits its member nations from linking their currencies to gold, even the currencies of its gold-producing members. Thus, the IMF essentially requires its members to stick with the US dollar as the world reserve currency. GATA does not urge countries to adopt a gold standard for their currencies. It's a very arguable issue. But except for gold-producing countries whose currencies are also international reserve currencies or potential reserve currencies like China's, why would any gold-producing country join an international organization that forbids it from making the most of its own gold resources? Do African governments even know what the IMF's gold policy is? That is, to assist US policy to drive gold out of the international financial system and thereby weaken gold's price? Are the dollar loans given by the IMF to developing countries that produce gold worth the double slavery those loans impose? First, the burden of repayment, and second, the subservience of the currency to a colonial master. No West African countries seem to be members of the Bank for International Settlements, but since the BIS is a major mechanism of gold price suppression, West African countries also might want to pay the BIS a visit in Switzerland. And your countries also might want to invite to your own foreign offices the ambassadors from the major countries that control the BIS board and ask them a few questions about gold price suppression policy. You might ask them about the BIS documents I showed you on Monday. If your countries have Russian and Chinese embassies, you might want to invite their ambassadors to discuss what the Bank of Russia and the People's Bank of China know about gold price suppression policy. They know all about it too. Now, why does all this matter? What can be done about it? How might it end? All this matters not only because West Africa is being deprived of a market price for a primary export, but also because the rigging of the gold market is the rigging that facilitates the rigging of all markets everywhere. If you rig the currency markets, you rig everything currencies can buy, especially commodities. And West Africa produces many commodities in addition to gold. The rigging of the gold market is part of a much broader scheme by which a secretive and unelected elite in the United States and Western Europe controls the value of all capital, labor, goods, and services in the world, and thereby impairs or destroys all markets and democracy itself everywhere, obstructing the progress of mankind. This scheme enables the West, and especially the United States, rich countries, to live off the labor and resources of the developing world, poor countries. This point was made by the Russian central banker I told you about Monday, Oleg Mezhevskov, in his address to the London Bullion Market Association in 2004. If the United States did not issue the world reserve currency, it could not live beyond its means, consume so much more than the fruit of its own labor, as it long has been doing. In that case, the United States might risk falling to the level of a developing country, just like the countries of West Africa. But the unearned wealth that accrues to the United States from its being the issuer of the world reserve currency is not entirely a boon, for it has comprehensively corrupted my country, its markets, its politics, and its public morality. When you have so much unearned wealth, you do stupid, corrupt, and immoral things. You forget the value of honest labor. You exploit and lord it over others, and you make your money a god. For these reasons, America needs an end to gold price suppression and market rigging as much as the developing world does. The nations that rig the currency markets are operating a totalitarian and parasitic system. It is actually an old story, the latest manifestation of the everlasting war of the financial class against the producing class. Only it is hidden well enough that the producing class hasn't figured it out. The producing class is doomed until it does figure it out. This totalitarian and parasitic system might end in various ways. First, it's a question of world politics at the highest levels. The system may end simply upon exhaustion of the relatively small gold supply that is needed to keep the futures and spot gold markets operating. Supply was exhausted in March 1968, when the huge volume of gold offtake forced the London gold pool to close. Since last March, there have been signs that gold supplies are again critically tight in New York and London, the markets where the price suppression system concentrates. How much more gold from their reserves are the central banks suppressing the gold price prepared to lose? We don't know. That's top secret information. If you knew how much metal they were still prepared to lose and when it would run out, you would get very rich. The system may end when one country decides to pull the plug on it, exchanging US dollars and treasury bonds for more gold, real metal, than is available. France's insistence on exchanging dollars for gold in 1967 and 1968 was a big factor in the collapse of the gold pool. Even a smaller country might be able to destroy the system by selling US government bonds and buying enough gold and removing it from the banking system. Or the system may end as part of a plan by the major central banks to avert the catastrophic debt deflation that now threatens the world. A plan to inflate the debt away, essentially to default on it, by devaluing the major currencies against gold. This has happened before. If we have slide 6 of Peter Miller's study, for example, a study in 2006 by the Scottish economist Peter Miller concluded that to avert such a catastrophic debt deflation, central banks would need to raise the gold price by a factor of 7 to 20 times in order to reliquefy themselves, to dramatically increase the value of their own gold reserves as their currencies were devalued along with the debts of government and society generally. Now, slide 7, if we've got it, the Barsky and Quaintance study. In May 2012, the US economists and fund managers Paul Barsky and Lee Quaintance published a report speculating that central banks are already redistributing gold reserves among themselves in preparation for just such a currency devaluation and an upward revaluation of gold, even in preparation for gold's return as formal backing for currencies. Barsky and Quaintance did not seem to have inside information. Rather, they were speculating. But it was plausible speculation, and it has been supported in recent years by the switch of central banks from being net gold sellers to net gold buyers. If we've got slide 8 of the Bank for International Settlements paper, there is much speculation now that the Bank for International Settlements itself is pushing central banks in the direction of currency devaluation, doing this with what are called the Basel III revisions to international banking standards. The revised standards, which are to take effect in June, will reclassify unencumbered physical gold as what is called a Tier 1 asset, an asset equal to cash and government bonds in the calculation of the capital assets of commercial banks. The revised standards will also diminish the value of paper gold on a bank's balance sheet, gold credits based on metal that doesn't necessarily exist. Because of the Basel III standards, the commercial banks that trade gold may gain an incentive to hold the real metal and stop playing with gold derivatives. But the end of gold market rigging by central banks may also be a matter of education and publicity, a matter of whether governments that are not part of the gold price suppression scheme, as well as investors around the world, will ever realize that as much as 90% of the world's investment gold, supposedly being held in trust at investment banks, is, to put it politely, oversubscribed. That is, most of the gold people think they own may not exist. If there is ever such a widespread realization, and if delivery of the imaginary gold is demanded, the metal may rise to multiples of its current price, even as the holders of paper gold discover that they have been irredeemably cheated. While the prospect of much higher gold prices, of course, excites gold producers and investors, it raises its own questions. Will governments let gold investors keep extraordinary gains, or will governments impose windfall profits taxes on them, or even try to confiscate gold? Decades ago, confiscation was undertaken in the United States and other countries. If the gold price soars, will governments let mining companies keep taking metal out of the ground at current royalty rates, or will royalty requirements be sharply raised? Will governments even let private companies keep mining gold at all? On the other hand, if there is no general realization of the frauds of paper gold and central bank market rigging of the gold market, then gold price suppression, the destruction of markets generally, and the oppression of the developing world may go on forever. Africa must not let that happen. And Africa may be able to stop this crime just by standing up for itself, by realizing that the continent cannot be fully free when, for international trade, it is dependent on another country's money and rigged markets. To stop this crime, Africa must confront Western governments and central banks. Gold was nearly everybody's money for thousands of years. It could be everybody's money again, and Africa is sitting on so much of the metal. Gold is the decisive instrument of your liberation. Yet Africa, like Central and South America and Asia, is full of rich countries insisting on being poor, insisting on remaining slaves to a colonial power that suppresses the value of the developing world's resources. Those who struggle against Western central bank gold price suppression policy are up against nearly all the money and power in the world, but they have justice on their side, which favors the continued ascent of man. Africa can help force the gold issue into the open and thereby advance the ideals of democratic, transparent, and limited government, of fair dealing among nations, of individual liberty, self-determination, and the brotherhood of man, which in the end are what gold as money has always been about. Africa can be free, in fact, not just in appearance, and can devise its own prosperous future at last, a big colony no more. You have the resources, not only gold, but oil, other minerals, agricultural production, and vast human talent if you can ever fully educate and protect the health of your people. While the colonial powers are still operating, they no longer can shoot you or put you in prison for wanting to be yourselves in your own countries. You are free if you will be free. You need only some patriotism and courage. Are they still within you as they were within you during your independence movements in the last century? Look for them in your past. Look for them in America's own past. They are still there. You can find them again. We could have our concluding slide here. Of course, GATA wishes you every success and will be delighted to help. If you'd like more information about GATA's work or assistance locating any of the documents I've mentioned or other information about the issues we have discussed, please email me at cpowell, CPOWELL@GATA.org. In any case, please consider going to our internet site and subscribing to our free daily electronic newsletter. We aim to keep our friends updated about important or just interesting developments in the monetary metals. Thanks again for your kind attention and indulgence and for the hope you have given me. And once again, if there is any time left, I will welcome your questions and comments.
I think you know that Chris Marcus is not around, so I'm going to put you on the spot a bit because we had planned to talk a little bit about silver. I mean, I know you had to leave that in. So if you don't mind, could you?
Neri, I can't hear you.
So if you don't mind, Chris, could you just give us a little commentary on silver? We've talked about gold. Chris Marcus, we're going to speak briefly about the squeeze.
No, I'm sorry, Neri, I'm not picking up the audio here.
Now, not to put you on the spot.
Now I can hear you.
Chris Marcus was going to be here to speak a bit about silver. The silver squeeze is over, right? So, Chris, I know you were speaking about gold and gold price manipulation, but I know you know some about silver. Just to give a little context towards the next session, could you comment a bit about silver? Silver
Sure.
price manipulation. How is it different from gold? How is it similar? What could you say about silver with regards to everything else you said about gold?
Silver is a monetary metal, and as such, it is a terrible threat to central bank currencies. People could use silver as money just as they've used gold. Central banks don't want people using silver as money as a store of value any more than central banks want gold used as money. The problem for central banks with silver is that they have not had the reserves in silver that they've had in gold. The United States used to have a big silver reserve, but when the United States removed silver from its coinage in 1965, the United States ran down its silver reserve, helping to keep the silver price down, and eventually ran out of the metal. I cannot prove that the silver stash that has been accumulated by the big U.S. bank, J.P. Morgan Chase, is a government reserve, but I have always suspected that the silver stash that Morgan has developed over the last decade or so is probably being held in trust for a government, if not the U.S. government, then the People's Bank of China, perhaps, and that this reserve, nominally held by J.P. Morgan Chase, is being drawn upon to hit the silver price as necessary to keep it from getting away from from central banks. Silver market analyst Ted Butler has written for years that as a practical matter, silver is scarcer than gold. Now, silver exists in the Earth's crust about 16 times greater than gold does. That's the traditional ratio between the availability of silver and gold from a mining perspective. However, silver is much more an industrial metal than gold. Nearly all the gold that has been mined throughout history has been put aside, put into monetary jewelry or hoarded and is still available. However, most silver is consumed in manufacturing. As a practical matter, there is far more gold above ground than there is silver. There's more silver below ground than there is gold, but in terms of accessibility, gold right now is much more accessible than silver. And that's why some market analysts who are critical of central banks believe that silver is the more deadly metal to central banking, because they have much more trouble controlling the price because the above ground stockpile is smaller than their accessibility to gold. Right now, there is enormous concentration on silver in the news because there seems to be more trouble in keeping the silver price down than in keeping the gold price down. People on our side think that silver is the mechanism by which the whole system can be brought down, because it's harder for central banks right now to suppress the silver price. But they can do it the same way they do it in the gold market. They can sell futures in the silver market. They can disorder from the J.P. Morgan Silver Reserve. But I think they're having trouble with it because there's a lot of anecdotal reports out of London and New York that silver is scarcer than gold right now. You know, I root for silver for the same reason I root for gold, because it's a weapon against the unaccountability of central banking.
Ground and low ground supply. But you touched on something. A lot of these questions I'm asking you, by the way, is leading towards the next session about money. Something I was studying is about the ratio. I think historically, the price of gold and silver has been about, I think, 20% difference, that ratio, between that 16 and 20%. So it's interesting what you're even speaking about, the ratio even of availability of silver versus gold. So in your opinion, back to silver possibly being that tool that sends the system, turns the system on its head. I shouldn't say crashing. You laugh. But if so, we see what's going on with the silver squeeze. This is going to affect gold probably. What does this now do to fiat currency? Back to that ratio, do you ever see that ratio that used to be historically between silver and gold will ever come back? One. Two, we're just talking theory. If this silver run eventually bursts, this bubble, how does this affect gold, and how does this affect fiat currencies? And not just the dollar, but in general in the world.
It's a measure. Silver is a measure of government currencies, just as gold is, and just as all commodities are to some extent. The gold-silver ratio, which I think was as high as 71, that is the price ratio, the ratio of the gold price to the silver price, I think a few months ago was above 70. I think it may have been pushing 80 or 90. It has been coming down sharply in recent months. That means that silver has been becoming more valuable relevant to gold. Silver's rise in price will be taken as a signal of the erosion of the value of government currencies, just as the rise in price of gold is taken as a indicator of a devaluation of government currencies. Even commodities generally, when they rise, they are taken as a signal, as a weakening of government currencies. So governments and central banks are very worried about silver. In fact, I mentioned the removal of silver from United States currency, from coinage, when the Coinage Act of 1965 was enacted. Back then, when he signed the Coinage Act of 65, President Lyndon Johnson put out a statement, his signing statement, in which he warned the markets that speculators should not invest in silver expecting the price rise, because the United States would use its silver reserve to tamp the price down. It would dishoard from the silver reserve, just as the United States would dishoard from its gold reserve. Now, this was in 1965. The President of the United States said, look, we're going to manipulate the price of silver. If you try to get any ideas about its price rising, we're going to try to thwart you with that. And the United States did, but it sold out its silver reserve. It doesn't have that silver reserve anymore. JP Morgan may have what is equivalent to the US silver reserve now. And the United States government probably doesn't want to know, who is the true owner and the true beneficiary of that silver reserve at JP Morgan, because if it was known that that silver reserve in the custody of JP Morgan was actually a government reserve and was being used for price control, that mere knowledge might blow up the whole system too.
We have, before Nee takes over, to have a conversation with you. I'm summarizing this question. Lots of people, the people in studio out, people have been buzzing since Monday, but I'm summarizing the question. I think a lot of people here feel they're concerned about the policymakers. You talked about South Africa, and I think that really was a little crushing. If South Africa has this information and has done nothing, we're hopeful that the West African government would do something. But the people here are saying, what can people in the grassroots do? Simple things that people in the grassroots could do if the policymakers are not budging or are not listening or take too long to react. Everybody here is feeling empowered and wants to know what are simple things they could do on their own towards making that switch to, switch is the wrong word, adjustment about money and gold and silver. So I think now people, they're looking for, they want something to do. What would you advise? The companies, because you already know, we had a conversation. There are several companies now involved in the value chain. There's goldsmiths, there's people who are ready to go for this. You spoke about India. The Indian government may have anti-gold policies, but the people maybe are more educated. What practical advice would you give the layman?
Well, you can clamor and agitate at virtually any level. I mean, many West African countries are largely democratic. You can go to your individual legislators, your local government officials. You can call attention to this issue and ask them to clamor about it. You've got news organizations in West Africa. You can go to them and ask them to investigate and publicize this issue. You've got Western embassies in West Africa. You can go knock on their door and ask to talk to them about this issue. You can clamor to international financial news organizations. It wouldn't surprise me if the Wall Street Journal has some readers on the internet in West Africa. You could clamor to the Wall Street Journal, write letters to the editor to the Wall Street Journal. The Financial Times particularly has probably got subscribers in West Africa. The Financial Times is terrible. I've been clamoring with the Financial Times for many years. A few years ago, I had a meeting with a reporter at the Financial Times headquarters on Southwark Bridge in London. I gave him all the documents. Nothing came from it. Once I was interviewed in London at a dinner by The US editor of the Financial Times, Gillian Tett, handed her on all the documents. She did write a column about the issue, but of course she never put a critical question to any central bank either. You may have some influence on the Western financial press. You know, you can go to the embassies of the Western powers. Anything you can do to raise this issue, to get it in the public domain, likely will be helpful. On a personal financial level, of course, you know, you can buy gold and silver, physical gold and silver. You can avoid investment in paper gold and paper silver products. Certainly, you've got, as I can see from your conference, you've got no shortage of gold producers and jewelers in West Africa. Every bit of metal, real metal, that you take off the market increases demand and makes things more troublesome for the central banks that are suppressing the price. But I think the most effective action right now would be the mobilization of a Western African government, just one government, to stand up and make an issue of this in international forums. I'm sure there are Africa-wide political organizations, the Organization of African States, things like that. You can raise this issue in regional forums. You can't go wrong. I think there's just about any way you can raise this issue, but government would be most effective. I find it hard to believe that there is no government in West Africa that would be willing to raise this issue with the American ambassador, or with the Bank for International Settlements, or with the International Monetary Fund.
Oh no, Chris, we actually have faith that there's at least one government in West Africa that's ready to move forward. But what the people are here, I think I'll say this: you had people so excited, they wanted something to do. They didn't quite want to hear it's only the government who has a responsibility. The people are like, surely there's something we can do. In line with that, what you were saying about, you know, we had a conversation about West Africa. It's interesting that you can see, even with the ECHO, the new currency that the Francophone West African governments have put together, you're seeing moves, and I think presently it's backed by the euro. They're probably considering backing it by gold. Really, I think West African governments are open. So don't see that question in any way we're not saying our government has no interest. The people are just saying, we don't want to wait for the government. Tell us something to do. So thank you for that practical advice, Chris. It's been a pleasure having you here Monday, Wednesday. Like I said, expect to hear from us soon. The policymakers are buzzing, we're buzzing. It'll take us some time in digesting this, but we've had lots of conversations that we can't even have online, but we're very grateful. Thank you. Thank you for being gracious also on silver. So now this is an official outro with this to hand over to Nii to have a conversation with you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Neri.